Vivian Mercer didn't say a word when Mara Ellison walked through the front gate of Iron Creek Ranch with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a worn leather journal pressed against her chest, like it was the last thing she owned in the world. Because it was. Vivian just looked at her, the way a person looks at something they've already decided to throw away, and said, "Follow me." She led Mara past the main house, past the bunkhouse, past the equipment shed and the hay barn, all the way to the back edge of the property, where the tree line started and the wind came off the ridge cold and mean. There was a stone building sitting there, half swallowed by blackberry vines, its chimney cracked, its door hanging open on one broken hinge. Vivian stopped in front of it. "This is your kitchen," she said. Mara stared at the building. Part of the roof had caved in on one side. There was a bird's nest wedged into what used to be a window frame. "You want me to cook in there?" "I want you to try," Vivian said, and the way she said it made clear she expected Mara to fail. "Before we go any further, if you've ever been handed someone else's leftovers and told to be grateful, if you've ever walked into a room where everyone had already decided you didn't belong, stay with me. Because what Mara Ellison did next is the kind of thing that doesn't make the history books. It just quietly saves everything around it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Iron Creek. Mara had not always been the kind of woman who accepted things quietly. There was a version of her, not so many years ago, who would have turned around right there at that broken door, walked back to Vivian Mercer's smug face, and said something she'd probably regret. The Mara of 10 years ago had opinions. She had a house, a husband, and a catering business that had fed half the county at one point or another. She had a life that made sense on paper. Then the debts came. Then the husband left. Then the business collapsed in the way small businesses do when the money runs out and the goodwill runs out at exactly the same moment. And there's nothing left to do but stand in an empty commercial kitchen at 2 in the morning, staring at equipment that's about to be repossessed. She was 40 years old when all of that ended. 40 years old with a recipe journal her grandmother had given her, $38 in a checking account, and a job listing she'd found tacked to the bulletin board at the feed store in the nearest town. Iron Creek Ranch, cook needed, room and board included. No experience with livestock required. She'd driven 4 hours to get here. And now Vivian Mercer was handing her a ruin and calling it a kitchen. Mara stepped through the broken door. The floor was stone, which was the first thing she noticed, and stone held up better than wood. There was debris everywhere. Old feed sacks, broken tools, a rusted pot the size of a wash basin sitting in the corner like it had given up. The stove was cast iron, which meant it had survived things lesser stoves hadn't. It was buried under years of grime and one entire abandoned wasp's nest, but it was still standing, still structurally intact. She walked to it and put her hand flat on the iron surface. Cold. Completely cold. But solid. Behind her, Vivian said, "Breakfast is expected at 5:30. The hands eat before they work." "When do I get supplies?" "There's a pantry in the main house. I'll have someone bring what we can spare." "What we can spare," Mara repeated. "Is that a problem?" Mara turned around and looked at Vivian Mercer for the first time without looking away. The woman was somewhere in her mid-50s, dressed practically, with the particular kind of controlled expression that people develop when they've spent years managing things they secretly resent. There was something else there too. Not cruelty exactly, but something close to it. A satisfaction in the arrangement that went beyond professional efficiency. "No problem," Mara said. 5:30. I'll be ready." Vivian left without another word. Her footsteps crunched back across the frozen ground toward the main house. Mara stood alone in the broken kitchen and let out a breath she'd been holding since she walked through the front gate. She didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry. But she stood there for a long minute, her hand still on that cold iron stove, and let herself feel the full weight of where she had ended up. A 40-year-old woman in a building half open to the sky, hired to cook for people who didn't know her existed yet, by a woman who was already hoping she'd quit. Then she put her journal down on the cleanest surface she could find, opened it to a blank page, and started making a list. The ranch hands found out about the new cook, the way they found out about most things at Iron Creek, through Elias Boone. Elias was 63 years old and had worked the property for 27 of those years, which made him the closest thing the ranch had to institutional memory. He was not a tall man and not a particularly imposing one, but he had the quality that certain older working men develop over decades of hard labor, a complete and total lack of interest in wasting time on things that didn't matter. He came to find Mara that first evening, not because Vivian sent him, but because someone had seen smoke coming from the back building, and he wanted to know if it was about to burn down. He found her on her knees in front of the cast iron stove with a wire brush and a tin of stove black, working the rust off the fire door with the focused concentration of someone defusing a bomb. "You got that thing running?" he said from the doorway. "Not yet," she said without looking up. "But I will by morning." He looked around the kitchen. She'd already cleared out the debris into a pile outside. The broken tools were sorted, some stacked for repair, some set aside as scrap. The rusted pot had been moved outside and filled with snow to test whether it held water. The floor had been swept to the stone. "Vivian put you in here," he said. It wasn't a question. "She did." "You know why." Mara set down the wire brush and looked up at him. "Because she thinks I'll quit." Elias nodded once. "Will you?" She looked at the stove, then back at him. "Who did the cooking before I came?" Vivian had a woman from town driving out 3 times a week, cold food mostly. The boys have been heating beans on a camp burner for the last month. "A month of cold food and beans," Mara said. "It's been a rough season," Elias said carefully, like he was choosing his words around something he wasn't ready to explain yet. "What's the owner like?" That landed differently than she intended. Elias's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "Mr. Ashcroft has been dealing with some personal matters," he said. "He leaves the operations to Vivian." "For how long?" 2 years, give or take." 2 years. Mara filed that away without comment. She picked up the wire brush again. "I'll have something hot ready by 5:15 tomorrow," she said, "in case anyone comes by." Elias stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, "There's a root cellar about 60 yards east of here, behind the old equipment shed. Vivian doesn't know about it, or if she does, she's never used it. Might have things in it, might not." He left before she could respond. Mara sat back on her heels and stared at the stove. A root cellar. She wrote it in her journal. Well, she didn't sleep that night. Not really. She got the stove running around 11, a small miracle involving a salvaged length of stovepipe, a clay patch she mixed from dirt and ash, and a focused ferocity that surprised even herself. The fire caught on the 3rd try. The iron began to warm. The cracked stone walls of the kitchen, which had been cold as a meat locker, started to hold a little heat. She sat close to it and went through every supply Vivian had sent over. A sullen young man in his 20s had delivered them in a single box, which was insulting in itself. Flour, salt, a small bag of cornmeal, 3 cans of condensed milk, dried beans, yes, a slab of salt pork that had been cut from a larger piece, which meant there was more somewhere. Mara thought about what she could make from that list that would actually feed men who had been outside in the cold all day. She thought about the root cellar. At 2 in the morning, she put on her coat and went to find it. It was exactly where Elias had said. The door was horizontal, set into a low earthen mound, so grown over with dead grass that it was nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. She had to dig the latch out from under a frozen inch of dirt. When she pulled it open, the smell hit her first. Cool, dark, earthy, and underneath that the unmistakable scent of things that had been stored with care. She lowered herself down the wooden steps. There were carrots, old, some of them going soft but not gone. Turnips. A crate of potatoes that had seen better days but still had firm flesh under the wrinkled skin. Several jars of preserved tomatoes, 2 of which had sealed properly, and 2 of which she set aside as suspicious. Dried onions hanging from a nail in the ceiling. A tin of lard, nearly full. She stood in that cellar for a long time. Someone had put these things here with the intention of coming back. Someone who knew what they were doing. And then life had moved on, or changed, or fallen apart, and the cellar had been forgotten, and the food had sat here quietly waiting for a person who knew what to do with it. Mara carried up what she could use and went back to her kitchen. By 5 o'clock, there was a pot of soup on the stove. Nothing fancy, carrots and turnips and potato, and the salt pork rendered down into a broth that smelled like something a person would actually want to eat. Cornbread in a cast iron pan, browned on top. Strong coffee. The first ranch hand who pushed open the kitchen door at 5:20 didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there, looking at the food and the fire, and the woman standing at a stove that no one had used in years. "You actually got it running," he said. "Pull up a seat," Mara said. Quote, by the end of the first week, 7 of the 9 ranch hands were eating at the stone kitchen. Vivian noticed. She came by on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the doorway, the way a person stands when they're deciding how to rearrange something that has inconvenienced them. The kitchen was warm. The smell of drying herbs, pulled from a patch of overgrown garden Mara had found pressed against the south wall, hung in the air. There was a pot of stock simmering on the back burner, made from bones she'd asked Elias to save from whatever the ranch was slaughtering. "You're using the root cellar," Vivian said. "Found it on a walk," Mara said. "Those supplies belong to the estate." "I know. I've been logging everything I take out and everything I preserve or stretch. If you want to look at the records—" "I don't," Vivian said sharply. Then she caught herself and smoothed her voice back to something professional. "I need to know what you're planning to ask for in terms of additional supplies. There's a budget." "I'd like to see it," Mara said. Silence. "The budget," Mara clarified. "If I know what we're working with, I can plan properly. I can make sure we don't run short going into winter." "That's not your concern," Vivian said. Feeding the hands is exactly my concern." The two women looked at each other across the warm kitchen. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the sky had taken on the flat white color that old ranchers read like a page of bad news. "I'll see what I can arrange," Vivian said finally. She left. She did not see what she could arrange, but Mara had expected that. She sat down at the table that evening and opened her journal. She wrote down the date, the temperature, the contents of the root cellar, the current supply situation, and at the bottom of the page, a number she had been working toward in her head all week. Based on what she knew, Iron Creek had enough food in its forgotten corners and neglected spaces to survive the winter. But only if someone managed every single pound of it, and only if winter came when she thought it would. She looked at the sky through the cracked window she'd propped back into its frame with 2 pieces of salvaged wood. It was coming early. She could feel it the way she felt things she couldn't explain. The way the old-timers in her grandmother's town used to read seasons in the behavior of animals and the color of the moon. She underlined the date she'd written. Then she wrote next to it, in small, careful letters. "We have less time than anyone knows." The note Mara left under Elias Boone's bunkhouse door on a Friday night was not long. It said, "I need to show you something, tomorrow morning, before the others are up." Elias found her at the root cellar at 4:30, her lantern throwing a small circle of yellow light against the dark. He didn't ask how she'd known he'd come. He just pulled his coat tighter against the cold and looked at what she'd laid out on the ground beside the cellar door. A careful arrangement of jars, crates, and containers, each one labeled in her small handwriting with what it was and how much remained. "This is everything hidden on this property that nobody's using," she said. He crouched down and picked up one of the jars. Preserved green beans sealed tight, the date scratched into the lid in a hand that wasn't Mara's. "These are from 3 years back," he said quietly. "Still good. I tested 2 of them." She paused. "Someone put these up who knew what they were doing. Someone who planned ahead for a bad season." Elias set the jar back down carefully, like it was something that deserved to be handled with care. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said finally. "Caleb's wife. She ran the kitchen stores. She's the one who set up the root cellar properly, years back." Mara had guessed something like that, but hearing it said out loud changed the weight of it. She looked at the jars lined up in the dirt and thought about a woman she'd never met, putting up food against a winter that never came for her. "When did she pass?" Mara asked. 3 years ago, March." He stood up slowly, his knees not what they used to be. "After that, things just stopped being managed. Vivian took over operations, and she's competent at the business end of things, ordering supplies and keeping the accounts. But she's not a woman who thinks in terms of what's already here. She thinks in terms of what needs to be purchased. Which means she's been spending money on things the ranch already has." "Yes." "And missing things the ranch doesn't have enough of." Elias looked at her. "Such as?" Mara opened her journal to a page she'd been building for the past week. Column after column of numbers, observations, estimates. "Salt," she said. We have about 40% of what we need to properly preserve through a hard winter. The smokehouse hasn't been fired in over a year. There's a hay situation that I don't fully understand, but the hands have mentioned it twice in passing in ways that made me think there's less than there should be. And the supply road, she pointed north toward the ridge. If we get a heavy early snowfall, that road closes. And from what I've seen of the sky the last 2 weeks, we're going to get one. Elias was quiet for a long time. The lantern flickered between them. Vivian is not going to listen to any of this coming from you, he said. I know. And Mr. Ashcroft, he stopped. Tell me about him, Mara said. Not what Vivian says about him, the real version. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. It was the gesture of a man deciding how much truth to hand someone he'd known for less than 2 weeks. But something about the way Mara stood there, direct, patient, not performing anything, must have made the calculation easier. Caleb Ashcroft is not a bad man, Elias said. He's a man who lost his wife and then lost himself. And in the space between those two things, he handed the wheel to someone he trusted and walked away from the front of the vehicle. He's been in the back seat for 2 years. He comes out, he walks the property, he signs what Vivian puts in front of him. But he's not present, not the way he used to be. What was he like before? He was the kind of man who knew the name of every hand on this property and their family situation. He could walk a field and tell you what it needed. He built most of the hay storage himself, back when he was 26. Elias shook his head slowly. Whatever's left of that man is still in there somewhere, but grief does what grief does. Mara looked down at her journal. I'm going to need your help, she said. Doing what exactly? Documenting everything. Every resource this ranch has that isn't being used. Every waste, every gap. I want a clear picture of where Iron Creek actually stands going into winter, not where Vivian's accounts say it stands. She looked up at him. And then I'm going to figure out how to get that picture in front of Caleb Ashcroft before the snow makes the decision for all of us. Elias studied her face for a moment. A 40-year-old woman with cold hands and a lantern and a journal full of numbers, standing in the dark outside a root cellar that a dead woman had stalked 3 years ago. You know Vivian will come after you if she finds out, he said. She's already trying to get rid of me, Mara said. She put me in a broken building on the edge of the property and told herself I'd quit by the first frost. And you didn't. No, Mara said simply. I didn't. Elias looked at the jars one more time, then he nodded once, not enthusiastically, not with any particular warmth, just the single solid nod of a man making a decision he'd probably been circling for a while. I know where the smokehouse key is, he said, and I can get you the hay numbers without anyone asking questions. That's a start, Mara said. They stood there in the cold dark for another few seconds, two people who had both been overlooked by this ranch in different ways and for different reasons, standing over the preserved work of a woman who hadn't been overlooked at all, but was simply gone. Then Elias picked up his lantern and walked back toward the bunkhouse, and Mara went back to her kitchen to start breakfast. The smokehouse revelation came 4 days later, and it was worse than she'd expected. Elias walked her through it on a Tuesday afternoon when Vivian had driven into town for a supply meeting with a vendor. A meeting Mara had quietly noted happened with some regularity despite the ranch supposedly running on a tight budget. The smokehouse was a solid structure, well built, the kind of construction that only deteriorates when it's neglected rather than used. The fire pit inside was intact. The hanging racks were intact. The vents were workable, but the supply of wood suitable for smoking had been depleted and not restocked. And more critically, when Mara checked the estate's salt supply against what she knew they'd need to properly cure meat for winter, the gap hit her like a bucket of cold water. 42 pounds, she said. Against what? Against 200 minimum to do this right. She stood in the center of the smokehouse and did the arithmetic in her head, which she'd always been able to do faster than most people did on paper. If we slaughter at the right time and cure everything we need, the beef, the pork, the hanging birds, we need at least 200 pounds of salt. We have 42. Elias leaned against the doorframe. Vivian's been ordering salt through the regular supply vendor. How much? I'd have to pull the records. Pull them, Mara said. And while you're in there, see if you can find where the discrepancy is, because either the salt is going somewhere it shouldn't be, or someone has been severely underestimating what this operation requires. She didn't say out loud what she was beginning to suspect. Not yet. The numbers needed to speak first before she let herself draw conclusions from them. What she did do was write a letter to a merchant in the nearest town, using her own money, the small amount she'd managed to hold back from her collapsed life, to order an additional 30 pounds of salt. It wasn't enough, but it was something. It was the difference between bad and catastrophic. The letter went out with the ranch's weekly mail run, tucked in without a word to anyone. The garden was the thing that quietly broke her heart, though she would never have said it that way. She found it properly, or rather, found what was left of it, in the second week of November, when the first real cold descended on the property and she was walking the perimeter of the kitchen garden she'd been slowly rehabilitating. She'd already pulled the kitchen's own small plot back into usefulness, clearing the blackberry invasion and finding hardy herbs and root vegetables that had survived on sheer stubbornness under the weeds. But behind the main house, on the south-facing slope that caught the most light, there was a larger garden, or had been. The beds were still framed with lumber, the kind of careful construction that someone had put real time into. The soil inside them, even after 2 years of abandonment, had the texture of ground that had been worked well and often. She crouched down and dug her fingers into the dirt of one bed, turning it. A volunteer potato came up, then another, then a handful of small, knobby things that had seeded themselves from whatever had been growing here when the garden was last tended. She sat back on her heels and looked at the whole slope. If someone had kept this going, it would have fed the ranch through most of the season. The south exposure, the prepared beds, the soil quality. Someone had known exactly what they were doing here. She thought about the woman in the root cellar again, the careful handwriting on the jar lids. She started turning beds. It was too late in the season to plant anything meaningful, but she could prepare the ground for spring, and more importantly, she could harvest what remained. The volunteers, the survivors, the things that hadn't known they were supposed to stop growing when everyone stopped paying attention to them. Over the next 3 afternoons, between breakfast service and dinner prep, she pulled from that garden 14 pounds of volunteer potatoes, a significant amount of kale that had gone to seed but was still edible, beet greens, 3 late cabbages that had been invisible under the overgrowth. She brought everything back to the kitchen and processed it, blanching and packing what could be stored, cooking immediately what couldn't wait, adding what she could to the tally in her journal. On the evening she finished the garden inventory, she sat at her kitchen table and looked at the full picture for the first time. It wasn't good, but it was better than nothing if everything she'd found was managed carefully. If the smokehouse came back online in time, if the salt order arrived, if no major disaster hit the stored provisions, Iron Creek had a reasonable chance of feeding its people through winter. The word "if" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She underlined it, unconsciously, 3 times. Elias brought her the supply records on a Wednesday evening, slipping them under the kitchen door wrapped in a piece of oilcloth like he was passing her contraband, which in a manner of speaking he was. Mara spent most of that night going through them. The numbers were not, at first, obviously wrong. Vivian kept clean records. The columns added up. The invoices matched the ledger entries. On the surface, it looked like competent management of a moderately complex ranch operation. But Mara had run a business. A real one, with real margins and real waste and real vendor relationships. And she knew the difference between numbers that were clean because everything was right and numbers that were clean because someone had arranged them carefully. The salt was the first thread she pulled. According to the records, Vivian had been ordering salt regularly through a vendor called Hargrove Supply out of the county seat. The quantities ordered were not unreasonable for a ranch this size, except that when Mara looked at the price per pound and compared it against what she'd paid for her emergency order from the town merchant, the difference was significant. Not enormous, but consistent. Month after month, the Hargrove price was running about 18% higher than market. 18% on a single supply item was annoying. 18% across every supply category was something else. She went back through the records with that lens and started marking pages. Flour, feed corn, lamp oil, preserving jars. The ranch had been buying new jars when there were hundreds of usable ones sitting in the storage barn that no one had inventoried. Salt pork purchased commercially when the ranch's own hogs were being processed and the excess was going to waste. She stopped at that entry and read it twice. The ranch was buying salt pork from outside while its own pork processing waste was being discarded. She wrote that down in her journal and circled it twice. By 3 in the morning, she had filled 4 pages with figures and observations. The picture they painted was not of dramatic theft. Nothing so simple as someone stealing from the till. It was something more insidious, a pattern of decisions that consistently chose the more expensive outside option over the existing inside resource, in ways that benefited whoever was setting up those vendor relationships. She thought about Vivian's regular trips to town. She thought about Hargrove Supply. She thought about the way Vivian had cut her off when she'd offered to show her the kitchen's resource records. I don't, sharp, immediate, need to see those. Mara closed the ledger. She was not going to take this to Vivian. That door was closed before it opened. She needed Caleb Ashcroft, and she had no idea how to reach a man who had spent 2 years making himself unreachable. She got her opening by accident, the way most important things happen. It was a Saturday, mid-morning, and she was outside the kitchen scrubbing the large cast-iron pot, the one she'd rescued from the corner on her first day, which had turned out to be completely sound once the rust came off, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path that led from the main house. Not the quick, purposeful stride of Vivian, something slower, someone who was walking because the walking itself was the point. She didn't look up immediately. She kept working the pot. The footsteps slowed and stopped about 10 feet away. "You got the Holloway pot running," a man's voice said. She looked up then. He was in his mid-40s, probably, though he looked older around the eyes. Tall, with the build of a man who had done real physical work for most of his life and had recently stopped. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and no hat despite the cold, and he was looking at the pot in her hands with an expression that had nothing to do with the pot itself. "Is that what it's called?" Mara said. "My grandfather brought it from Missouri. It's been on this property for 60 years. He looked at her. "You're the cook." "Mara Ellison." "Caleb Ashcroft." He said it without any particular weight, like a man who had stopped expecting his own name to mean much. She held his gaze for a moment and then went back to scrubbing. Not rudely, just working. "How did you get the kitchen running?" he asked. "That building's been closed since—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Since your wife passed," Mara said, and she said it straight, without softening it or dancing around it, because she'd found that people in grief were often more relieved by directness than by careful avoidance. He went very still. "Vivian said the kitchen was available," Mara continued, setting the pot down and drying her hands on her apron. "So I used it. The stove needed work, but the bones were good. Whoever designed that building knew what they were doing." She paused. "There's still food in the root cellar that your wife put up. I've been working from it. I hope that's all right." Caleb Ashcroft looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't quite name. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more complicated than that. "She would have liked that," he said finally. His voice was level, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "Mr. Ashcroft," Mara said carefully, "I don't want to overstep, but I've been here 6 weeks, and I found some things about this ranch's situation that I think you need to know about, not Vivian, you, before winter comes." He looked at her with this careful expression of a man who had learned to be cautious about people bringing him things to know. "What kind of things?" he said. "Resource things, supply things." She hesitated, then decided on the honest version, and some financial things. "In the supply records." The air between them changed. He didn't react the way she'd been half expecting, defensively, dismissively, with the authority of a man who doesn't appreciate being told his house isn't in order. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her with an expression that was, more than anything, tired. "Vivian manages the operations," he said. "I know she does," Mara said, "and I understand why. I'm not trying to cause trouble." She held his gaze. "But I've been keeping records of my own since I got here, and there are some numbers that don't match up the way they should. And winter is coming earlier than your supply schedule is prepared for. I've seen the sky. I've watched the animals. The first hard snow is going to come before the last supply wagon gets through, and right now I don't think this ranch has what it needs to come through that clean." Caleb Ashcroft looked at the kitchen building, the smoke rising from the chimney she'd repaired, the neat stack of firewood she'd organized against the south wall, the kitchen garden, visible beyond the corner of the building, showing the marks of someone who'd gotten down in the dirt and actually worked it. You've been busy, he said. I don't know another way to be, she said. He stood there another moment, then, show me your records. Now? You said before winter. What's that mean to you exactly? Mara looked at the sky. Same flat white it had been showing for days, the clouds sitting low and heavy and still. 2 weeks, she said. Maybe less. Caleb followed her into the kitchen. He sat at her table, the scarred wooden table she'd found in the equipment shed and dragged to the kitchen herself, which wobbled on one leg until she'd shimmed it with a piece of folded tin, and she put her journal in front of him and the supply records beside it, and she stood across from him and walked him through everything she'd found. She didn't editorialize. She didn't accuse. She just let the numbers tell the story, pointing to figures and explaining what they meant in plain language. The way she'd learned to talk about money during the years of running her own business. No jargon, no softening, just the facts and what they added up to. Caleb listened without interrupting. He was not, she realized as she watched him, a man who had lost his intelligence along with his motivation. His eyes moved over the pages with the attention of someone who understood what he was reading. When she pointed to the Hargrove supply pattern, his jaw tightened slightly. When she showed him the salt inventory against what was needed, he did the math in his head the same way she did, and she could tell from his expression when he landed on the same number she had. 42 pounds, he said, against 200 minimum. He sat back in his chair. I ordered 30 more on my own account, Mara said. It should arrive this week. That gets us to 72, which is still short, but it's the difference between some preservation and none. He looked up at her. You spent your own money. I didn't have another option. You could have told Vivian. I tried, Mara said. She told me it wasn't my concern. The muscle in his jaw moved again. He looked back down at the records. The Hargrove pricing, he said. You think this is deliberate? I think it's worth asking the question, Mara said carefully. I don't know what the relationship is between your estate and that vendor, but the pattern has been consistent for 18 months, and the markup is consistent, and it's across multiple supply categories, not just one. That's harder to explain as oversight. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed against the kitchen wall, and the fire in the stove fluttered and steadied. My wife used to tell me I trusted too easily, he said, finally. Not to Mara specifically, just set it into the middle of the room, the way a person says something they've been sitting with for years. Mara didn't respond to that. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel like stepping on something that wasn't hers to step on. What do you need? Caleb said. I need permission to work the smokehouse. I need Elias to have the authority to pull supplies from any storage on the property without going through Vivian first. I need someone to go into town before the road closes and get the additional salt and whatever else is on my list. She pulled a folded piece of paper from the back of her journal and set it on the table. I need 2 weeks and a reasonable amount of cooperation, and I think I can get this ranch through winter. He picked up the list. Read it. This is thorough, he said. I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks. He set the paper down. He looked at her. Really looked at her. The first time someone on this property had looked at her like a person rather than an intruder or an inconvenience or a problem to be managed. Why are you doing this? He said. You could walk away. Find another situation. You don't owe this ranch anything. Mara thought about how to answer that honestly without making it more meaningful than it was. I don't quit things, she said. I tried that once. It didn't suit me. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite get there. All right, Mrs. Ellison, he said. He stood up from the chair, tucking her supply list into his coat pocket. You have your 2 weeks. He walked to the kitchen door and stopped with his hand on the frame. He looked back once at the room, the fire, the organized shelves, the pot hanging clean and dry on the hook she'd hammered into the wall. She would have liked you, he said. Then he walked out into the cold, and Mara stood alone in the kitchen she'd rebuilt from nothing, with 2 weeks and a list and the flat white sky pressing down on every inch of Iron Creek like a warning none of them could afford to ignore. She put her journal back in front of her and turned to a fresh page. At the top of it she wrote, Day 1 of 2 weeks. Then she got back to work. The supply wagon made it through on a Thursday, 9 days after Caleb Ashcroft walked out of Mara's kitchen with her list in his coat pocket. It carried more than she'd asked for. She stood in the yard watching them unload and counted the salt sacks as they came off. Not 70 pounds, not 100, but 160, which meant someone had gone significantly beyond the bare minimum she'd calculated. There were also 2 additional crates of dried beans, a barrel of molasses she hadn't requested but immediately understood the value of, and 3 new smoking racks to replace the rotted ones she'd found in the smokehouse. Elias came to stand beside her as the last crates came down. "He went himself," Elias said quietly. "Caleb drove in 2 days ago and spent a full day with the merchant." Mara absorbed that without comment. "Vivian doesn't know yet," Elias added. "She will by afternoon." "Yes," he agreed. "She will." Mara turned away from the wagon. "Let's get the smokehouse fired before that conversation happens." They worked through the morning, Mara, Elias, and 2 of the younger hands who Elias had quietly brought into the effort without making it a formal assignment or an announcement. The smokehouse fire took on the 3rd attempt, which was 2 attempts more than Mara would have liked, but 1 less than she'd feared. She stood inside the stone building in the smoke and the heat and checked each hanging rack, tested the vents, watched the draw of the chimney to make sure the years of disuse hadn't compromised its function. It worked. Imperfectly, unevenly, the way old things work when you first ask them to do their job again after a long rest. But it worked. She came outside with soot on her forearms and smoke in her hair, and she wrote 1 word in her journal under the day's date. Smokehouse. Then she underlined it. Vivian found out at 2 o'clock. Mara was back in the kitchen, processing the first batch of meat for curing, when she heard the voice, sharp, controlled, the particular pitch of a person who is furious but has made a decision to express that fury through precision rather than volume. The sound moved toward the kitchen from the direction of the main house. The door opened without a knock. Vivian Mercer stood in the frame with her coat still on, which meant she'd come straight from wherever she'd been when the news reached her. "You went to Caleb," she said. Mara did not stop working. She was rubbing salt into a cut of pork with her hands, a task that required consistent pressure and attention. "Mr. Ashcroft came to me, actually. I showed him the resource records I'd been keeping." "You showed him my supply records." "I showed him the ranch's supply records," Mara said. "Which document the ranch's resources?" Vivian took 2 steps into the kitchen. "You have no authority to pull materials from estate storage. You have no authority to fire the smokehouse. You were hired to cook meals. That is the extent of your role here." Mara set down the cut of pork and turned around. She was aware of how she looked. Hands white with salt, apron stained, hair coming loose, and she was also aware that none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the next 30 seconds. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "I have 160 pounds of salt, a running smokehouse, and 12 days before that ridge road closes for the season. Whatever conversations need to happen about authority and role definition can happen after winter. Right now I need to cure about 400 pounds of meat, and I need to do it without interference." The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. Not the silence of someone absorbing what had been said. The silence of someone deciding. "You have no idea what you've walked into," Vivian said. "Then tell me," Mara said. But Vivian didn't tell her. She turned and walked out, and the broken hinge door swung behind her, and Mara turned back to the salt and the pork and the work. Her hands were not entirely steady, but they were steady enough. What Mara hadn't anticipated was how the ranch hands would respond to the change in atmosphere. It wasn't that they became openly defiant of Vivian. Most of them had been on the property long enough to be careful about that. But something subtle shifted in the days after Caleb reappeared in the operations of his own ranch. Men who had been drifting through their work with the low energy of people whose situation had stopped making sense started showing up to things with a different quality of attention. 3 of them came to Mara without being asked. The first was a young man named Pete Darrow, 19 years old, who appeared at the kitchen door on a Friday evening and said he'd heard she was getting the smokehouse going and that his family had kept hogs in Missouri before they came west, and he knew how to do it proper if she needed help. She put him to work immediately. The second was an older hand named Russ, who didn't say much but showed up Saturday morning with a repaired fence post tool and spent 4 hours fixing the gap in the root cellar door frame that had been letting cold air in and damaging the stored vegetables. He didn't ask for anything in exchange. He just fixed it and left. The third was a woman, which surprised Mara. She hadn't realized there was another woman on the property. Her name was Delia, and she worked with the horses, and she came to the kitchen on Sunday afternoon with a sack over her shoulder and set it on Mara's table. "Dried apples," Delia said, "and some walnuts. I've been keeping them in my room because I didn't think anyone would bother managing them properly." Mara looked in the sack. There were several pounds of each, yet enough to make a real difference in winter provisions. "Why are you giving them to me?" Mara asked. Delia looked at her with the frank expression of a woman who didn't have patience for indirect conversation. "Because you're the only person on this property in 2 years who's behaved like we're all going to be here in the spring," she said. Mara didn't have an answer for that. She just nodded and added the contents to her inventory. That evening, she sat at her table and looked at what the tally had become. It wasn't enough for comfort. She wasn't going to pretend it was. But for the first time since she'd arrived at Iron Creek, the numbers were moving in the right direction. Not because the situation had changed dramatically, but because a handful of people had stopped waiting for someone else to make the first move. She thought about that for a while. Then she thought about the sky, which had shifted again in the past 2 days. The clouds sitting lower, the air having that particular dead-still quality that came before significant weather. She thought about what she'd told Caleb Ashcroft. 2 weeks, maybe less. She had not been wrong often about weather. She had grown up around people who read it the way others read print, and the habit had gotten into her before she was old enough to know it was unusual. She wrote in her journal, 5 days, possibly 4. Then she went to bed, because 4 or 5 days wasn't much, and she needed the sleep. On the 3rd day after Caleb's supply wagon arrived, Vivian Mercer did something Mara hadn't prepared for. She stopped fighting, not visibly, not in any way that announced itself. She didn't come to Mara with an apology or a gesture of cooperation. She simply withdrew, stopped coming to the kitchen, stopped sending instructions through the young, sullen hand who'd been her primary means of communicating displeasure. Went quiet, in the way that cold fronts sometimes go quiet, before they show you what they actually brought. Elias noticed before Mara did. "She's been in the account book since Monday," he said, catching Mara outside the smokehouse on the 4th day. He spoke low, though there was no one nearby. 3 days straight, she's not managing operations, she's going through the financial records." Mara thought about what that meant. "She knows I showed Caleb the Hargrove numbers," she said. "Yes." "She's getting ahead of it." Elias nodded slowly. "That would be my read." Mara wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the main house. "Does Caleb know she's doing that?" "I don't know what Caleb knows. He's been different this week. He's out more, talking to the hands more. But he and Vivian aren't speaking much, from what I can tell." A cold gust came off the ridge, and Mara looked up at the sky almost involuntarily. Still that flat white. Still that particular stillness in the air. "I need to talk to him again," she said. "About Vivian?" "About the North Storage Barn." She'd been turning something over in her mind since the previous night. "The roof on the North Barn has 2 places where the boards are questionable. If we get significant snow load and ice, the weight could be a problem. I've been thinking about it. We should move the most critical supplies, the cured meat, once it's done, and the salt stores, to the stone building. It's solid. The North Barn isn't." Elias was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of work in a short time." "I know," Mara said, "but losing the salt stores would be worse than the work." He looked at her steadily. In the weeks since she'd arrived, something had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, because neither of them was particularly built for that kind of easy warmth, but something more durable than professional cooperation. A mutual recognition. 2 people who saw things similarly and had stopped being surprised by that fact. "I'll get Pete and Russ," Elias said. "Well, she found Caleb at the fence line on the property's eastern edge, doing something she wouldn't have expected, actually repairing the line himself, not supervising, not watching, but with his sleeves pushed up despite the cold and a pair of wire pliers in his hand. She stopped a few feet away and waited for him to notice her. He glanced up. "Mrs. Ellison." "The North Storage Barn," she said. "The roof. I want to move the critical supplies before the weather hits." He looked at the fence line, then back at her. "You think it won't hold?" "I think it might not, and if it doesn't, we lose what's in it, and what's in it is the difference between a hard winter and a disaster." He set down the wire pliers. "How long to move everything?" "If I have 4 people in the cart, 2 days." He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "You have 4 people in the cart." She turned to go. "Mara," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name. "Vivian is going through the accounts," he said. "I know." She turned back slowly. "Do you know why?" His expression was careful in the specific way of a man who knows an answer he isn't ready to say out loud yet. "I have a reasonable idea," he said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let her finish," he said. "And then I'm going to sit down with everything she's compiled and everything you showed me and get a complete picture." He picked the pliers back up. "Some things need to be seen all at once before you act on them. Otherwise, you make decisions before you understand what you're actually deciding." Mara nodded. She left him at the fence line and walked back across the property toward the stone kitchen, and she thought about what he'd just said. See it all at once before you act. And she thought it was probably the smartest thing she'd heard anyone on this ranch say in 6 weeks. It was also, she realized, the first time he'd talked to her like he was thinking out loud, like she was someone whose presence in the conversation he'd already decided to accept. That felt like something. She didn't know exactly what, but something. The snow came on a Tuesday. Not on day 5, as she'd predicted, on day 4. So she'd been off by 24 hours, which, under the circumstances, she was willing to forgive herself for. She woke at 3 in the morning to a silence that was different from ordinary silence. The packed, swallowed quiet of serious snowfall, absorbing all the sounds a working ranch makes at night. She got up without lighting the lamp, went to the window she'd repaired with salvaged wood, and looked out. It was already several inches deep and coming down hard, the flakes large and wet, the kind that packed quickly and stayed. She dressed without rushing, because rushing in the dark led to mistakes, and mistakes in winter weather cost more than they did in good conditions. She pulled on her heaviest coat, the one she'd bought 2 seasons ago at a price she'd considered unreasonable at the time and now considered the best money she'd ever spent, and went out. The kitchen stove needed to be stoked up fully before the temperature in the building dropped. The animals needed to know someone was awake, and she needed to check the smokehouse, where the last of the cured meat was still hanging. She moved through the snow by memory and feel, the way you learn a property after 6 weeks of walking it in every light and weather. The smokehouse was holding heat well, which was one thing right. The kitchen fire took fast, which was another. She put a pot of water on immediately, not for any particular recipe, but because hot water, in a developing winter emergency, was worth more than almost anything else, and you always wanted it ready. She was on her second trip between the kitchen and the smokehouse when she smelled it. Smoke. But not from the smokehouse chimney, not from the kitchen. Different smoke, sharper, hotter, with something chemical underneath it that made the back of her throat close. She stopped in the middle of the yard and turned in a slow circle. The north barn. There was a glow behind the barn's upper vent, orange, red, and flickering, the color that only means one thing. She ran. Not to the bunkhouse, not to the main house to get help first. She ran to the barn because she'd moved the supplies out of it 2 days ago, but she had not moved the equipment, and the equipment included the spare smokehouse salt, 40 pounds she'd set aside as overflow when the stone kitchen reached capacity. And if that salt burned, they were back to a number that meant people went hungry before March. The barn door was hot to the touch. She used her coat sleeve to grab the handle and yanked it open, and the smoke that rolled out hit her like a wall, thick and gray and tasting of burning hay and old timber. She went in. The fire was in the upper loft. Hay that had been stored up there had caught, probably from an ember issue with the old lantern hook near the east wall, the one she'd noticed 3 weeks ago and mentioned to Elias, and written in her journal and then let slide because there were 40 other things competing for her attention. That was a mistake she filed away without time to feel bad about it. The salt was in the northwest corner, as far from the fire as possible. She got to it in the smoke with her eyes burning and her lungs doing something unhappy, found the 50-pound sacks by touch and shape, and dragged the first one toward the door. The snow outside was still falling. She got the first sack out, dropped it, went back in for the second. The smoke was worse on the second trip. The fire had found something it liked in the loft and was moving faster. She could hear the sound of it. Not a roar, not yet, but a hungry, spreading crackle that was traveling toward the center of the structure. She found the second sack, got her hands around it. Something cracked overhead. A beam, adjusting to heat. She moved. She got the second sack to the door and threw it, and dropped it in the snow and stood in the yard in the dark and the falling snow with her lungs full of bad air, coughing until she could see straight again. The shouts were already coming from the bunkhouse. Somebody had seen the glow through a window. She could hear running footsteps, doors, Elias's voice above the others with a particular edge of authority cutting through the chaos. She stood in the snow next to 2 sacks of salt and looked at the burning barn and thought, with the strange calm that sometimes arrives in the middle of catastrophe, the supplies are out. The smokehouse is running. The stone kitchen will hold. She thought, we are going to be all right. Then the coughing came back and knocked her to her knees in the snow, and she stayed there for a while, hands pressed flat on the cold ground, breathing carefully. Elias found her there. He didn't say anything immediately. He crouched down beside her and put a hand on her back, steady and solid, the way you put a hand on something that needs to know it's not alone. The barn burned for 2 more hours. The snow helped contain it. The wet, heavy flakes that had seemed like an enemy an hour ago turned out to be the thing that kept the fire from jumping to the hay storage building next door. By the time the sky began to show any light, the barn was a ruin, but only the barn. Everything they'd moved, everything they'd prepared, intact. By full morning, every hand on the property was standing in the yard looking at the wreckage. The snow had not stopped. The road north was already invisible under a foot of accumulation, which meant the ridge pass was closed, exactly as Mara had calculated. They were on their own. Caleb came and stood beside Mara without preamble. His face showed the barn, the loss of it, the ugliness of it. But underneath that, his expression had a quality she hadn't seen in him before. Something focused and awake. "The salt?" he said. "Out. Both sacks. They're in the stone kitchen." "The cured meat?" "Already transferred 2 days ago." He nodded slowly. "The smokehouse is still running," she added. "We'll lose some heat management without the barn as a windbreak on the east side, but I can compensate with the rotation schedule." He turned and looked at her. Not the considering look he'd given her in the beginning, the sizing up look of a man deciding how much to trust a stranger. Something else. The look of a man who has seen someone make the right call under pressure and knows what that means. "You went in there for the salt," he said. "It was necessary." "You went in alone." "There wasn't time to get anyone else, and the time mattered," she said simply. He looked at the burned barn again. Then he turned to the hands assembled in the yard. 9 of them, including Delia and Pete and Russ, all of them standing in the falling snow with the particular posture of people waiting for direction. "Elias," Caleb said. "Sir, I want a full inventory of everything we have as of this morning. Mrs. Ellison is going to direct that process. Whatever she tells you we need to do with the stores, that's what we do." He looked around the group. "Any questions about that?" Nobody said anything. Nobody looked at the main house, where Vivian Mercer was visible in an upper window, standing still, watching. Mara noticed. She didn't comment on it. She turned to Elias instead. "Start with the stone kitchen. I want everything counted and recorded before noon." He nodded and moved, and the others fell in behind him, and Mara stood for another moment in the snow beside the burned ruin of the north barn. She thought about the salt. 2 sacks, 80 pounds total. She thought about the preserved meat hanging in the smokehouse, and the jars lined up in the stone kitchen's shelves, and the root cellar still holding its cold and dark. She thought about the list she'd made on her first night in this place, sitting close to a fire that had taken 3 tries to light, with $38 to her name and no idea yet whether any of this was possible. Her hands ached from the cold. Her lungs still felt gritty from the smoke. There was a burn on her left forearm she hadn't noticed until Delia pointed it out. Not serious, but real, the kind of mark that would stay for a while. She looked at it for a moment. Then she pulled her sleeve down over it and went back to work. The snow kept falling. The snow kept falling. The smokehouse kept smoking. And somewhere inside the burned wreckage of the north barn, under 2 feet of white and gray ash, the things that had been lost began the slow process of becoming irrelevant compared to the things that had been saved. Iron Creek was going to get through this winter. Mara knew it now, with the same certainty she'd felt standing in front of that cold cast-iron stove on her very first night. Not confidence exactly, because confidence assumed you knew how everything would go, and she'd long since stopped believing anyone could know that. Something quieter than confidence, something that lived closer to the ground. The certainty of someone who had looked at what she had, refused to pretend it was more than it was, and decided to work with it anyway. She opened her journal to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote, "Barn lost. Salt saved. Road closed. We have what we need." She underlined the last sentence twice. Then she capped her pen, put the journal in her coat pocket, and walked through the snow toward the stone kitchen, where the fire was burning and the work was waiting and the long winter had only just begun. The burn on Mara's forearm healed slowly, the way burns do when you keep using the arm. She wrapped it each morning with a strip of clean cloth and unwrapped it each night and tried not to think about it, which was easier said than done when you were lifting cast iron and hauling salt sacks and keeping a fire going 16 hours a day. Delia checked it every few days without being asked, appearing at the kitchen door with a small tin of salve she'd mixed herself from rendered fat and dried herbs, examining the wound with the same practical attention she gave to the horses in her care. "It's not getting worse," Delia said on the fourth day after the fire, which was apparently the threshold for good news where burns were concerned. "Good," Mara said. "It's not getting better either." "It will," Mara said, and turned back to the stove. Delia stayed in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. She did that sometimes, not quite leaving, not quite saying the things she'd come to say. Mara had learned to wait it out. "People are talking about you," Delia said finally. "What kind of talking?" "The good kind." A pause. "Mostly." "What's the mostly?" "Russ thinks you're too hard. Says you run the kitchen like a military operation." Mara considered that. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the edge of the table nearest the door, an invitation that Delia accepted by stepping inside and sitting down. "Is he wrong?" Mara asked. "Little bit." Delia wrapped both hands around the cup. "But only a little bit. What you're doing, the rationing, the rotation schedule, the logging everything twice, people understand why it's necessary. They just don't love being managed quite so precisely. If I'm less precise, we run short in February. I know that. I'm just telling you what I hear." Mara sat down across from her. "What else do you hear?" Delia looked into her coffee. "Vivian hasn't been out of the main house in 3 days." That was new information. Mara turned it over. Since the morning after the fire, when Caleb had publicly redirected the chain of operations toward Mara and Elias, Vivian had maintained a visible but reduced presence on the property, appearing at meals in the main house, occasionally crossing the yard, never approaching the stone kitchen. That distance had felt deliberate. 3 days without appearing at all felt different. "Does Caleb know?" Mara asked. "He's the one who told me," Delia said. What Caleb knew, and what he told Mara 2 days later when he came to the kitchen on a morning when the cold had dropped to the kind of temperature that made the air feel solid, was more than she had expected. He came in without knocking. Everyone had stopped knocking. The kitchen had become the kind of place people walked into. And he sat in the chair across from her table and put a folder of papers down in front of him. Not Mara's journal papers. His own documents, his own handwriting, organized with the methodical care of a man who had been doing something very specific with his time. "I need to tell you what I found," he said. Mara set down the spoon she was holding and sat. "The Hargrove supply relationship," he said. "It's been running for 22 months. The markup you identified, the 18%, was the visible part. The part that showed up in the general supply records." He opened the folder. What didn't show up there was a separate account, a discretionary operations account that Vivian has had signatory authority over since she took over management. "I set it up myself after—" He paused. "After my wife died, I told Vivian she had full authority to manage operational expenses without bringing them to me. I signed a general authorization." "You trusted her," Mara said. "I trusted her," he confirmed. "And for the first 18 months, the account was used more or less appropriately. Reasonable expenses, nothing that would have raised a flag even if I'd been looking." He turned a page. "Then about 4 months ago, the pattern changed. The withdrawals got larger, less specific, and the timing of them corresponds with increased orders from Hargrove." Mara looked at the papers without touching them. "How much are we talking about?" "Across the full period, if I include the markup differential and the discretionary account withdrawals that I can't account for operationally." He stopped, started again. "Enough to have rebuilt the north barn 3 times over." The room was quiet except for the fire. "She was skimming," Mara said. "Not a question. The more charitable interpretation is that she made a series of poor financial decisions under the pressure of managing a grieving owner's property and things got out of hand, Caleb said. He was looking at the papers, not at Mara. The less charitable interpretation is that she saw an opportunity in a man who wasn't paying attention, and she took it. What do you believe? He was quiet for a moment. I believe that both things can be true. That she started by taking advantage of a situation and then got comfortable with it, and that neither interpretation changes what happened. Mara looked at him across the table. He looked older than he had when she'd first seen him at the cast iron pot outside the kitchen. Or maybe not older, more present. Like a man who had been standing at a distance from his own life and had recently taken a step back toward it, and the step had cost him. What are you going to do? She asked. That's partly why I'm here, he said. He finally looked up from the papers. Legally, I have grounds to pursue this. The amounts are significant enough that a court would take it seriously. But that road is long and ugly, and at the end of it, whatever I recover will not equal what it costs to get there. He closed the folder. The other option is that I sit down with Vivian and lay out exactly what I know and give her the choice of making restitution on a structured schedule or facing the legal process. Accountability over punishment, Mara said. Something like that. He looked at her. My wife used to say that destroying something for the satisfaction of destroying it was a luxury only people with nothing left to build could afford. Mara was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. He said it plainly, without the careful distance he'd used around that subject in every conversation before. She was also stubborn and opinionated, and she argued with me about ranch decisions more often than not. And I was right maybe 40% of the time, which means I was wrong 60% of the time, and she was gracious enough not to keep score. Something crossed his face. Not grief this time, or not only grief. Something warmer than that, and sadder than that, and more complicated than either. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, the 60%. Mara didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be heard by someone who wasn't going to try to fix them. After a moment, Caleb put the folder under his arm and stood up. I'm going to talk to Vivian this afternoon, he said. Do you want me there? No. He said it without hesitation, and Mara respected that. But I wanted you to know before it happened, because without what you showed me, I wouldn't have looked. And if I hadn't looked, he stopped. The ranch would have come through winter on what I could salvage, Mara said, because it was true, and because she thought he needed to hear something true right then. But barely, he said. Yes, she agreed. Barely. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame, the same spot he'd stopped the first time he left this kitchen, weeks ago now, when he told her his wife would have liked her. He didn't say anything this time. He just nodded once and walked out into the cold. Mara didn't hear what happened in the main house that afternoon. She heard some of it secondhand from Elias, who had been in the equipment barn when the voices in the main house became audible, despite the closed windows and the snow and the general effort of two adults trying to conduct a private conversation. He didn't give her a full account. That wasn't Elias's way. But he came to the kitchen that evening and sat at the table and accepted a bowl of soup and said, in the careful tone of someone reporting only what they'd actually witnessed, she cried. Mara waited. Not at the beginning, Elias said. At the beginning she denied it. Then she admitted the small parts. Then she admitted more. Then she cried. He ate a spoonful of soup. I've worked for a lot of different people in my life. That particular progression, that's always been the one that tells you when someone actually knows they were wrong. When the crying comes after the admission instead of before it. What did Caleb do? Mara asked. Sat there. Elias paused. Talked to her for a long time after that. I couldn't hear the words, just the register of it, like two people figuring something out rather than one person punishing another. Mara thought about what Caleb had said, accountability over destruction. She's not leaving, Mara said. He offered her a choice. She took the one that doesn't end in a courtroom. Elias set his spoon down. She'll be repaying the estate through reduced compensation over the next 3 years. She keeps her position, but with a completely restructured arrangement. All financial decisions go through Caleb directly. He's putting his own hands back on the management of this place. Mara absorbed that. It was not the outcome she would have necessarily chosen. Vivian Mercer had made things difficult for Mara since the first day, had tried to push her out, had used her position to obstruct and ignore. There was a version of Mara that would have wanted something harder, something with more weight to it. But she sat with the feeling and watched it settle, and what she landed on was something closer to understanding than resentment. Vivian had also been a person managing a grief-hollowed ranch with an absent owner, and whatever she'd done wrong, she'd also kept the property running through 2 difficult years in ways that a person who'd walked away entirely might not have managed. Human situations were rarely as clean as the part of you that wanted justice wished they were. She wasn't going to say any of that out loud, but she thought it. "There's something else," Elias said. Something in his voice made her look up. "The Barnett place," he said. "About 4 miles west. Tom Barnett's son rode in this morning while you were at the smokehouse. They're in trouble. The father's got a lung ailment, the wife's been managing alone since the snow came, and they didn't put up enough for winter. They've got children." Mara's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "How many?" "3 young ones. The youngest is maybe 4. She thought about the Stone Kitchen's inventory, the careful numbers she'd been tending like a patient in recovery, the margins that were workable but not generous. She thought about a woman 4 miles west, managing a sick husband and 3 children in a storm, alone. "What did you tell the boy?" she asked. "I told him I'd ask," Elias said. Mara got up and went to the shelf where she kept her inventory journal and opened it to the current week's page. She stood there for a solid minute, running the numbers, moving things around in her head, looking for the places where there was give and the places where there wasn't. It was not a comfortable exercise. The truth was that the margins at Iron Creek were real but not large, and sharing with another household meaningfully would require cutting something somewhere. She thought about Caleb's wife and her careful handwriting on the jar lids, the root cellar that had been waiting 3 years for someone to use it, the preserved green beans that had outlasted the person who put them up. She wrote a number in the margin of the inventory page. Then she wrote another one. Then she closed the journal. "Tell him to come back tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll have a box ready." Elias looked at her without speaking. "We can manage," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. "It's not that," he said. "I'm just noticing something." "What?" "That you came here with $38 and a broken stove, and now you're feeding people 4 miles away." Mara looked at the fire in the stove for a moment. Then she said, "Put another way, I got here with exactly what I needed." Elias almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The box she sent to the Barnetts the next morning was not as generous as she would have liked, and more generous than she could strictly defend on pure numbers. It contained dried beans, a portion of salt pork, preserved tomatoes, dried apples, a sack of cornmeal, and a smaller jar she packed last and almost didn't include. The second-to-last jar of the preserved peaches that had been in the root cellar, put up by a woman named Mrs. Ashcroft, who had never known anyone like the Barnetts, but would have understood why they needed something more than just survival food. She put the peaches in the box. Then she wrote out 3 sheets of instructions. Not recipes exactly, but practical guidance on stretching what she'd sent, how to make the dried beans go further, how to manage the salt pork to get the most preservation out of it, how to keep the cornmeal from going stale in the cold. She wrote it in plain language, the kind she used with Peta and Russ and the hands who'd never thought much about food management before this winter. She folded the pages and put them on top of the box and tied the whole thing with a length of twine. Tom Barnett's boy, 16, weathered beyond his years, with the particular expression of a young man who's been holding more than his share for too long, took the box with both arms and stood there for a moment looking at it. "My ma wanted me to tell you," he started. "Tell her to send word if they need more guidance," Mara said. "And tell her the instructions on top explain how to make it last. If she has questions, the answer to most of them is lower heat and more water than you think." The boy nodded. He adjusted the box in his arms and turned toward his horse. "Hey," Mara said. He stopped. "Your father's going to need warmth more than anything else. Keep the central room heated at the expense of everything else. The food can be managed cold. A sick man's lungs can't." He looked at her with the expression of someone receiving information that might matter whether he understood the full weight of it or not. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Then he rode off into the white. Word traveled the way words travel in isolated winter communities, slowly at first and then all at once. By the 3rd week of December, 2 more households within riding distance had sent people to Iron Creek, not with the desperation of the Barnett boy, but with the careful, half-apologetic manner of people who've decided to ask for help and aren't sure how it's going to be received. Mara received them the same way she'd received everything else that had come through the kitchen door. Practically, without performance, assessing what was needed and what was possible, and finding the middle ground between them. She did not give from the ranch's stores without Caleb's knowledge. That was a line she was careful about. Each time someone came, she went to him directly, laid out the situation and the numbers, and asked for his decision. He said yes every time, but she asked every time because it wasn't her property to give from, and she didn't intend to start treating it as though it was. Caleb, for his part, did something she didn't expect. He started coming to the kitchen in the mornings. Not every morning. 3 or 4 times a week, he would appear around 6, before the hands' breakfast, and pour himself a cup of coffee and sit at the end of the table while Mara worked. And sometimes he talked, and sometimes he just sat there in the particular comfortable silence of a person who has found a place where the silence isn't awkward. She learned things about him in those mornings that she couldn't have learned any other way. Not from Elias, not from the hands, not from anything Vivian had said or implied. She learned that he'd built the south fence entirely by hand the summer he was 23 because he couldn't afford to hire help. She learned that he'd grown up in Wyoming and come to this valley at 20 because a friend of his father's had offered him work and he'd taken it and never left. She learned that his wife had been a teacher before she'd come to the ranch, that she'd kept a small library in one of the upstairs rooms, and had read to the hands on winter evenings when the snow kept everyone inside. "Did you ever read to them?" Mara asked once, without thinking about it, the way questions come out when you're busy with something else, and your internal editor is occupied. He looked surprised. Then he laughed. The first real laugh she'd heard from him, short and a little rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in a while. "I'm not a reader," he said. "She used to say it was my only genuine flaw." "Only one?" Her words. He wrapped both hands around his cup. She was generous in her assessments. Mara smiled at the stove. "What about you?" he said. "Before all this, what did you do?" She thought about how to answer that in a way that was true without being a wound. "I ran a catering business," she said, "for about 7 years. It did well for a while, and then it didn't." "What happened to it?" "A combination of things," she said, which was the answer she'd worked out over the past year for when people asked. "Bad timing, some bad decisions on my part, some things I couldn't control." She paused. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have, financially. That was the main thing." She said it without bitterness. She'd worked through the bitterness the way you work through most difficult things. Slowly, inconsistently, with a lot of backward motion before the forward motion sticks. But it was through. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific kind of loss," he said, "when it involves trust." "Yes," she said. "It is." She didn't expand on it, and he didn't push. They sat with it for a moment, two people who had both learned what it cost to trust wrong, and then Mara turned back to the stove and Caleb finished his coffee, and the morning moved on. It was Delia who told her about Vivian. Not dramatically. Delia was not a dramatic person. She came to the kitchen on a Tuesday evening in the 4th week of December and said, in the manner of someone reporting a fact, "Vivian Mercer stopped me in the yard this afternoon." "What did she want?" Mara asked. "She asked me how to put up dried beans." Delia paused. "She said she wanted to learn." Mara turned from the stove. "She said she wanted to learn." Those words. Yes. Mara thought about that for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had handed her a broken kitchen on the edge of a property and walked away expecting failure. She thought about Vivian's expression the day Mara had pushed back at her across the warm kitchen. The particular kind of fury that comes from being outmaneuvered by someone you'd already dismissed. She also thought about what Elias had said. That particular progression, when the crying comes after the admission instead of before it. "Tell her she can come by Wednesday morning," Mara said, "after the breakfast dishes." Delia raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "People can learn things," Mara said. "That's generally considered a positive development." "Even her?" Mara looked at Delia steadily. "I'm not in the business of deciding who deserves to improve." Delia considered that. Then she nodded once and went back to the horses. Vivian came on Wednesday. She stood in the kitchen doorway at the agreed time in a clean apron and with the expression of a person who has practiced being somewhere difficult and is now executing that practice under real conditions. She didn't apologize for anything. Mara hadn't expected her to, and wouldn't have known what to do with it if she had. "You want to learn to preserve beans," Mara said. "And other things," Vivian said. "Practically speaking, what you've been doing this winter, the management of it." She stood straighter, which was a thing she did when she was uncomfortable, Mara had noticed. "Caleb is restructuring the supply management, and he's asked me to take a more operational role in the ranch provisions going forward. I'd like to do that properly." Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled a spare apron off the hook by the door and held it out. "The first thing you need to understand about beans," she said, "is that soaking time isn't optional and most people skip it. That's why most people end up with beans that don't hold up in long storage. You start there and you build everything else on top of it." Vivian took the apron without comment and tied it on. And that was how the two most difficult women on Iron Creek began, in the back kitchen of a stone building that had been abandoned for years, to work in the same room without either of them catching fire. It was not warm between them. It was not friendly. But it was functional, in the way that functional often matters more than warm during the hardest weeks of a hard winter. Vivian listened carefully and asked precise questions and made notes in a small book she'd brought, and Mara answered the questions directly without decoration, and by the end of 2 hours something had been established between them that was neither forgiveness nor friendship, but something more durable than both. A working understanding between two women who had more in common than either of them was prepared to acknowledge. The hardest week came in early January. The cold went to a level that no amount of preparation made comfortable, the kind of temperature that found gaps in every insulated thing and reminded you that winter at that latitude was not a season, but a verdict. 3 of the hands came down with a respiratory illness, not dangerous as far as Mara could tell, but exhausting and persistent, which in a working ranch in deep winter was its own kind of crisis because the work didn't stop just because the workers felt terrible. Mara slept 4 hours a night for 6 days. She managed the kitchen, the smokehouse rotation, the sick hand's specific dietary needs, broth, heat, a willow bark tea she knew from her grandmother that she couldn't have told you the science of, but that she'd watched work too many times to doubt, and the daily logistics of keeping Iron Creek's food supply moving in an organized way, while 3 of the people who helped her do that were lying in their bunks feeling like collapsed buildings. On the 5th night of that week, Caleb found her asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her journal and a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he put 2 logs on the stove without waking her and put his own coat over her shoulders and left the kitchen as quietly as he'd come in. She woke an hour later and found the coat. She sat for a moment looking at it. Then she put it back on the hook by the door and went to check on the smokehouse. She didn't mention it to him, neither did he. But something shifted in the space between those 2 facts. What he'd done without being asked, what she'd received without needing to name, and both of them moved through the days following with a different quality of awareness about the other. Not romance, or not simply that. Something slower and more substantial. The recognition between 2 people who have seen each other function under real pressure and have not been disappointed. When the sick hands recovered and the deep cold broke slightly in the 2nd week of January, and Mara slept 8 consecutive hours for the first time since before the fire, she woke feeling something she couldn't immediately identify. She lay still in the pre-dawn dark, working out what it was. Not happiness exactly. Not relief. Something more foundational than either. She felt like a person who knew where she was, not in terms of geography, in terms of belonging to a place, being inside a life that made sense, being the person in this particular spot at this particular moment for reasons that were real, that had developed out of actual choices she'd made and actual work she'd done. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt that. She got up and went to the kitchen and started the fire. Caleb showed up at 6:15, which was earlier than usual. He poured his coffee and sat at the table and looked at her with the particular look that she'd started to recognize as the one that meant he was going to say something he'd been sitting with for a while. "I've been thinking about the spring," he said. "What about it?" "About what this ranch looks like in the spring. What it could look like." He turned his cup in his hands. "The thing you've done here this winter. Not just the supplies, but what you've shown people. The women who came from the Barnett place to learn the preservation methods. The way the hands have started actually thinking about resources instead of just using them. He paused. That doesn't have to stop when the snow melts. Mara looked at the fire. I'm not going anywhere, she said, if that's what you're asking. Partly, he said. Not entirely. She waited. I want to formalize what you're doing here, he said. Not just cook, not just kitchen manager, which is a title that doesn't come close to what you've actually been doing. He set his cup down. I want you to have real authority over the food systems and the household provisions of this ranch, with appropriate compensation, a contract that reflects what you actually do. Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about walking through the gate of Iron Creek with a canvas bag and $38 and a recipe journal. She thought about Vivian Mercer's face when she'd said, "This is your kitchen," the certainty in it, the dismissal. She thought about the broken door and the cold stove and the bird's nest in the window frame. I want to think about it, she said. He looked at her. You're not going to just say yes. I'm going to think about it, she repeated, carefully, and then I'll tell you. He nodded slowly. A man who'd learned this winter to respect a person who thought before she answered. Take your time, he said. Outside, the snow was still on the ground, but the light had changed. January light, thin and pale, but present in a way December's hadn't been. The worst was not over. She knew enough about winters to know you didn't claim that before February. But the days were getting longer by minutes, and minutes mattered. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him, and the kitchen was warm, and the fire held, and somewhere in the stone walls around them the winter continued its slow, reluctant retreat. She gave him her answer on a Thursday. Not because Thursday meant anything in particular, but because that was the morning she finished thinking it through, and she'd learned long ago that sitting on a decision after you'd made it was just a way of pretending you hadn't made it yet. Caleb was at the table with his coffee when she came in from the smokehouse, and she set her gloves down on the shelf by the door and turned to face him and said, I'll take the position, but I want to write the terms myself and have you review them, not the other way around. He looked up from his cup. That way, she said, I know exactly what I'm agreeing to. That's fair, he said, and I want a garden budget, not what I can salvage from what's already here. An actual budget at the start of each season that I control. Also fair. And I want Elias to have a formal role in the provisions management. He's been doing the work anyway. He should have the title and the pay that goes with it. Caleb was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering. There was a difference, and she'd learned to tell them apart. Write it up, he said. All of it. I'll sign what's reasonable. It'll all be reasonable, she said. I know, he said, and went back to his coffee. She stood there for a second, aware of the slight absurdity of the moment. Two people settling a significant professional arrangement over a kitchen table before 7 in the morning without ceremony or witnesses in a building that 3 months ago had been a ruin. Then she pulled her journal from the shelf and sat down across from him and started writing. February came in mean and stayed that way for 3 weeks. The cold was the kind that made iron brittle and caused animals to huddle and refuse to move. And there was a second snow in the second week that dropped another 8 inches on top of what was already there and made the property feel truly enclosed for the first time all winter. The Ridge Road had been impassable since December and showed no signs of reconsidering. But Iron Creek held. The smokehouse ran without interruption. The root cellar maintained its temperature and its stores. The stone kitchen became, in those enclosed weeks, less a cooking space and more a center of gravity for the whole property. The place people came to warm up, to report in, to ask questions, to sit for a few minutes in the presence of a fire that was always going and a person who was always working. Pete Darrow, who had come to Mara 6 weeks earlier knowing only that his family had kept hogs in Missouri, had become by February a genuinely capable assistant in the preservation operations. He didn't have her instincts, nobody developed those without years, but he had a steady hand and a willingness to be corrected that Mara found more valuable than raw talent. She told him so once, directly, and watched the effect of it move through him the way honest acknowledgement moves through young people who haven't been told they're doing something right very often. My father always said I was too slow, Pete said. Too slow for what? Mara said. He thought about it. Just in general, I think. Slow people don't waste things, she said. In my experience, the slow ones are the ones who end up with something left at the end of winter. He didn't say anything, but he stood a little differently after that. Russ, the older hand who had quietly fixed the root cellar door frame in November without being asked, had taken on the responsibility of monitoring the stored supplies each morning and reporting any concerns directly to Mara. He did this with the thorough, unhurried attention of a man who had spent decades working with his hands and understood that small problems identified early were categorically different from small problems identified late. Twice in February, he caught issues: a jar seal that had failed on a batch of preserved tomatoes, a temperature fluctuation in the cellar after an unusually cold night, and reported them in time to address the problem before it became a loss. Mara thanked him each time, specifically, not generally. Elias noticed. "You're deliberate about that," he said one evening, "the way you acknowledge people." "Someone told me once that the difference between a good kitchen and a bad one is whether the people in it feel like they matter to the outcome," Mara said. "I don't remember who said it, some chef somewhere, but I found it to be true." "Who told you that?" "I honestly don't remember. It was a long time ago." She was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother, maybe. She wasn't a chef, she just ran a kitchen that everyone wanted to be in." It was one of the rare moments when Mara talked about something from before, and Elias received it with his usual steadiness, neither pressing for more nor sliding past it. "What was she like?" he asked. "Impossible to satisfy," Mara said. "In the best way. The kind of person who, when you did something right, would tell you exactly how you could have done it slightly better. Which sounds unkind, but actually means she thought you were capable of slightly better, which is the most important thing a person can communicate." Elias thought about that. "She'd have gotten along with you." "She'd have fought with me constantly," Mara said. "Yes." The thaw started in the third week of March, and it was not the gentle, cinematic kind of thaw that comes in stories. It was messy and slow and created mud that swallowed boot heels and made the yard look like it was digesting itself. The snow retreated in patches, revealing the ground underneath in various states of damage and preservation, and the barn ruin that had been cleanly covered by snow all winter re-emerged as the ugly, blackened truth of what a fire actually leaves behind. Caleb stood in the yard looking at it on the first warm morning, and Mara stood a few feet away, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm going to rebuild it," he said, "properly this time. Better roof, stone foundation." "When the ground firms up," Mara said. "When the ground firms up," he agreed. He looked at it for another moment. There was something almost ritual about the way he stood there, acknowledging it. Not just the barn, all of it. The 2 years of absence, the slow deterioration, the things that had been lost through neglect and trust misplaced, and a grief that had swallowed a man's attention whole. "I keep thinking about what would have happened," he said, "if you hadn't come." "Someone else would have figured it out," Mara said. "I don't think that's true." She looked at the burned barn site. "Maybe not this winter, but people figure things out when they have to." "You didn't wait for have to," he said. "That's the part I keep coming back to. You got here and the place was falling apart, and Vivian was pushing you out, and you didn't wait to see what happened. You just started." "I didn't have anything to go back to," Mara said. "That changes the calculation." "I'm not sure it's just that," he said quietly. She didn't argue with him, partly because she wasn't sure he was wrong. The Ridge Road cleared on a Tuesday in late March, and the first wagon through it brought mail, a new order of supplies, and 3 women who had ridden together from the settlements west of the valley. Mara was in the garden when they arrived. The south-facing garden she'd been preparing since the snow retreated, turning beds, amending soil, planning what would go where. She looked up when she heard the wagon and saw the 3 women climb down and ask Delia something that resulted in Delia pointing toward the back of the property. They came to find her. Their names were Clara, Ruth, and a younger woman who introduced herself simply as May. They'd heard about Iron Creek through Tom Barnett's wife, who had heard it from her son, who had watched Mara send him home with a box of supplies and 3 pages of instructions in December. The story had traveled and grown in the way stories do through a hard winter, picking up details and weight at each telling. "We heard you kept the whole ranch fed from a kitchen nobody'd used in years," Clara said. She was perhaps 60, with the practical, appraising look of a woman who had spent her life evaluating situations quickly. "We had enough if we managed it carefully," Mara said. "That's different from what people probably said." We also heard you went into a burning building, Ruth said. For salt. The three women exchanged a look. We want to learn, May said. She was the youngest of the three, maybe 30, with a directness that reminded Mara of herself at that age, or the self she'd been before life had taught her to be more careful about where she aimed her directness. Not just how to preserve things, all of it. How you think about it, how you plan ahead, how you figure out what you have and what you actually need. Mara set down her garden tool and looked at the three of them. Where are you from? She asked. I'm from the Hendricks settlement, Clara said. These two are from farther west. We've been talking all winter about how our households came through, and what the difference was between the ones that barely made it and the ones that didn't. And the difference kept coming back to planning. Not money, not supplies exactly, just whether someone had thought ahead. Mara looked at them for a long moment. Then she said, Come back Saturday morning. Bring whoever else wants to come. I'll have the kitchen set up. Clara looked at the stone building. How many can you fit in there? Mara looked at the kitchen she'd rebuilt from a ruin, the walls she'd patched, the stove she'd revived, the shelves she'd constructed from salvaged wood and will. As many as need to be there, she said. 11 women came on Saturday. Mara had not expected 11. She'd expected 4 or 5, maybe 6, if Clara had been persuasive. The kitchen held them, but only barely, with people standing against the walls and sitting on every surface that could reasonably bear a person's weight. And the room got warm enough from collective body heat alone that Mara had to bank the stove down. She hadn't prepared a lesson. She'd prepared a kitchen. The first thing, she said, standing at the work table with a piece of paper and a pencil, is knowing what you have, not what you think you have, what you actually have. Written down, counted, checked. She held up her inventory journal. I've been keeping this since November. Every jar, every pound, every resource on this property. And every time I thought I knew what we had without looking, I was wrong by at least 10%. Someone in the back said, 10% in which direction? Both, Mara said. Sometimes we had more than I thought, sometimes less. The point is that guessing isn't managing. She walked them through the basics, not recipes, not techniques, but the underlying logic of food preservation and resource management. Why salt quantities mattered, how temperature affected storage life, the difference between a sealed jar and a jar that looked sealed, how to calculate what a household actually consumed versus what it thought it consumed, which were, in her experience, reliably different numbers. She talked about the root cellar and what she'd found in it. She talked about the smokehouse and what had been required to get it running. She talked, carefully and without excessive detail, about the North Barn fire and what the preparation in the weeks before it had meant for the outcome. She did not talk about herself much. When Clara asked how she'd learned all this, she said, from a grandmother who didn't accept vagueness, and from running a business that failed, which taught me everything I'd been doing wrong, and then moved on. But she noticed, as the morning went on, that the women in the room were listening with a particular quality of attention. Not the polite attention of people being taught something they're supposed to find useful. The focused, hungry attention of people who recognized something they needed and didn't know where to find it. At the end of the session, Ruth stayed behind while the others filtered out. You should do this every week, she said. I have a ranch to run, Mara said, beginning to clean up. Bring them here, or go to them. But this needs to be a regular thing. Ruth looked around the kitchen. There are women from here to the Eastern Pass who came through this winter on luck and not much else. They need what you just gave us this morning. I gave you a few hours of basics, Mara said. You gave us a way of thinking, Ruth said. That's not the same thing. Mara paused in her cleaning. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, which had been the kind of place described by its effect rather than its appearance. Not beautiful, not particularly large, but a room where something real was always being done, and where anyone who came in learned something without being taught at. She had spent years trying to build something like that, and had failed and started over and failed again, and somewhere in the middle of all that failure, she had apparently absorbed the actual lesson, which was that it wasn't about the room. I'll talk to Caleb, she said. Caleb's response, when she raised it, was to be quiet for a long enough moment that she thought he was going to say no. Then he said, use the barn site. She looked at him. The burned one? I was going to rebuild it anyway. Let me rebuild it bigger. We can put a proper teaching kitchen in the East End, separate from the animal storage. He was already thinking through it in the way she'd come to recognize, the way he thought about practical things, systematically and forward. It doesn't have to be elaborate. Good stove, solid shelving, work tables. The same things you built in the stone kitchen, but designed for more than one person working at a time. That's a significant expense, she said. It's an investment in something that has a clear return. He looked at her with a directness that had been building over the months, a clarity of regard that had nothing to hide behind it. You know what Iron Creek's reputation was in this valley before this winter? Struggling, isolated, the ranch where the owner went quiet after his wife died. He paused. You know what it is now? She didn't answer because she suspected the answer and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The ranch where the woman from the stone kitchen figured out how to feed everyone, he said. That's worth more than a barn. Vivian Mercer's last day at Iron Creek came in early April, though not in the way Mara had expected. She didn't leave under a cloud. She left with notice, properly given, after a conversation with Caleb that Mara wasn't part of and didn't ask about. The structured repayment arrangement remained in place. She would continue making payments from her new position at a property management firm 2 valleys over, where she'd been offered a role that suited her considerable organizational abilities without putting her in charge of anyone's money without oversight. On her last morning, she came to the stone kitchen. Mara was alone, working through the spring inventory, identifying what had been used through winter and what remained and what would need to be restocked before the next season. It was satisfying work in a quiet way, the accounting of survival. Vivian knocked. She actually knocked this time. Come in, Mara said. She came in and stood near the door with her hands clasped in front of her, which was a posture Mara had never seen on her before. Not defensive, not controlled, just uncertain. Like a person who has prepared what they want to say and is now standing in the actual moment of saying it and finding that the preparation doesn't fully cover the reality. I owe you an apology, Vivian said, for how I handled your arrival, the kitchen, and the way I treated the situation. Mara set down her pen. I thought you were a problem, Vivian continued. Another variable I didn't want to manage. I'd been holding this place together on my own for 2 years and She stopped, started again. I'd made compromises that I told myself were practical and that weren't always. And then you came in and started seeing things I didn't want seen. She pressed her lips together for a moment. I told myself you were threatening what I'd built. What I'd actually built was a house of cards, and you were just air moving through the room. Mara looked at her. I don't need an apology, she said, but I'll take it. Something in Vivian's posture shifted. Not release exactly, but an adjustment. The slight unburdening of a person who has said a necessary thing. You're going to do something real here, Vivian said, with the teaching. The way the women talk about what you did this winter. She shook her head slightly. That's not nothing. Neither is knowing how to run the financial side of a property, Mara said. You were good at that part. The wrong part went wrong, but the skill underneath it is real. Vivian looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated. The look of a person receiving acknowledgement they hadn't expected and aren't quite sure what to do with. Take care of this place, Vivian said finally. I intend to, Mara said. Vivian left. Mara listened to her footsteps cross the yard and then the sound of a wagon and then nothing. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then she opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote the date and the spring inventory figures and kept working. What? The teaching barn broke ground in May. Caleb built it himself, the way he'd built things when he was young, not because he couldn't afford help, but because he'd remembered that he was someone who built things and that remembering had turned out to matter. Pete helped, and Russ, and a carpenter from town who came for 3 weeks and showed them how to frame the East End properly for the kitchen use Mara had specified. She had opinions about the specifications. Caleb had opinions about the construction. They disagreed about the window placement twice and the stove chimney positioning once, and all 3 disagreements ended with Mara being right and Caleb revising the plan, which he did without significant complaint after the first time, which set a useful precedent. The kitchen came together over 6 weeks. Work tables at the right height, which sounds like a small thing and is not. Shelving built to hold weight, not just look like shelving. A stove with 2 working ovens, which was a luxury by any reasonable measure, and which Mara had justified to Caleb by pointing out that teaching 2 people to use a single oven simultaneously was an exercise in frustration that produced worse results than teaching them separately. He'd accepted the logic. She suspected he'd been waiting for her to ask for something and had been prepared to say yes. On the day the stove was installed and fired for the first time, Elias came and stood in the doorway of the new kitchen and looked at it with the expression of a man who has seen something he didn't expect to live to see. "You know," he said, "when you showed up last October with that journal under your arm, I gave you a week." "I know," Mara said. "I told myself, she's too quiet. She'll fold when Vivian gets at her." He looked at the stove, the shelves, the work tables. "I was wrong about the quiet part." "The quiet was never the point," Mara said. "No," he said. "I see that now." The first formal session in the new kitchen happened on a Saturday in June, 6 weeks after the stove was installed. 17 women came, which was more than the room was designed for, and they made it work anyway, the way groups of women who want to learn something together have always made two small rooms work, by reorganizing the furniture, standing where necessary, passing things across people, and getting on with it. Mara stood at the front of the room and looked at them. She thought about October, the broken door, the cold stove, Vivian Mercer's retreating footsteps. She thought about $38 and a recipe journal and a sky that had told her, in the way skies speak to people who know how to listen, that winter was coming faster than anyone was ready for. She thought about what she'd made from that. Not perfectly, not without mistakes. She'd misjudged the fire risk in the north barn, and that had cost them. She'd pushed herself past useful exhaustion twice in January and made 2 rationing errors in the 3rd week that Elias had quietly caught and corrected without making a thing of it. She'd been harder on Russ than she needed to be in the first month, before she'd understood how he worked best, and she'd had to go back and reset that relationship with some effort. She was not the hero of a clean story. She was a person who had arrived broken in a different way than the place she'd arrived at, and the 2 broken things had, over a winter, fixed each other in the approximate way that 2 broken things can. "The first thing we're going to talk about," she said to the room of 17 women, "is inventory." A few of them smiled. Word had gotten around about what that meant, coming from her. "I know," she said. "It sounds like the least exciting place to start. I promise you it isn't." She picked up her journal. The original one, worn and thick with a full winter of notes. "This journal is the reason Iron Creek has food right now. Not talent, not luck, not any special ability I was born with." She held it up. "Knowing what you have, writing it down, looking at it honestly." She set it back on the table. "Everything else comes from that." They leaned forward slightly. The room adjusted toward her the way rooms do when the person talking is saying something real. Outside, the summer light came through the new windows at an angle that lit the work tables warmly. The garden Mara had been tending since March was visible through the glass, the south-facing beds, now properly planted and beginning to show the first real growth of the season, green against the dark soil, steady and unhurried. From the stone kitchen at the back of the property, 30 yards away, the smell of the morning's bread was still in the air, baked at 5, left cooling on the rack, not forgotten, nothing wasted. Caleb came to find her after the session had ended and the women had gone. She was in the garden, which was where he'd started to look for her when she wasn't in either kitchen, because that was where she went when she needed to think without being asked what she was thinking about. He stood at the edge of the bed she was working and didn't say anything immediately. She glanced up. He had the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding the best arrangement of the words. 17, she said. I counted, he said. It'll be 25 by August, she said. Maybe more. I believe you. He looked at the garden for a moment, at the stone kitchen visible beyond it, at the property that had come back to itself over a winter and a spring in ways he was still taking stock of. I've been thinking about something. I can tell. The deed to the stone kitchen, he said, and the garden. She stopped working and looked at him properly. I want to transfer them to you, he said, legally. Your name on the title. No conditions, no strings, no employment contingency. He met her eyes. That building and this ground are yours because of what you made them. I should have said that months ago. Mara was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the first morning she'd stood in that building with its broken door and cold stove and bird's nest in the window frame. She thought about the list she'd made on the floor with the stove black and the wire brush. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen and the failed business and the $38 and the long road of things that had not worked out the way she'd planned. She thought about how none of it had been wasted. Not in the end, not even the worst of it. "I'll have the contract reviewed," she said. He almost smiled. "I'd expect nothing less." She looked at the garden. Her garden, apparently, or becoming so. The rows of things she'd put in the ground in March when the snow was barely off, on the faith that spring would come, because spring always did, however long it took. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." "Your wife built something here worth building." She kept her eyes on the garden. "I want you to know I understand that. What I've done this year, I built it on top of what she laid down. The root cellar, the soil in these beds, the way this kitchen was constructed. She knew what she was doing." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she might have said too much. "She did," he said finally, "and she would have told you to stop giving her credit and take your own." Mara looked up at him. He held her gaze steady and clear, the way he'd learned to look at things this year, directly, without flinching from what was actually there. "All right," she said. She stood up, brushing the soil from her hands. The stone kitchen behind her held the warmth of the morning in its walls the way old stone does, slowly gathered and slowly given back. The new barn stood solid at the east end of the property, its kitchen smelling of fresh wood and new plaster and the first real use of a good stove. The garden held its rows. The smokehouse sat quiet, resting through the summer, waiting for fall. The ridge road to the north was open. The world had returned to Iron Creek, and Iron Creek had returned to itself. And somewhere in the accounting of all of it, a 40-year-old woman with a recipe journal had ended up standing in the middle of something she had built from almost nothing, on ground that was now legally and literally hers. She was not the person she'd been when she walked through that gate in October. She was something adjacent to that person, recognizable but different, heavier in some ways, lighter in others, more certain about fewer things, and more at peace with that uncertainty than she'd ever expected to be. She didn't know what came next specifically. She had a general shape of it, the teaching sessions, the garden, the work of seasons, the slow building of something that might outlast her in the way the best things do. She had a property with her name on part of it, and a man she trusted standing 10 feet away, and a kitchen that had once been meant to hide her from the world. It had hidden her from nothing. It had, instead, become the place the world came to find her. She put her gardening tool back in its place against the fence post, the way she put everything back in its place, because that was how you kept track of what you had, and where it was, and what it was worth. Then she walked back toward the stone kitchen, through the summer morning, past the garden she'd built from neglect, and the soil a woman she'd never met had prepared for someone she'd never known would come. The door stood open. It always